Hey everyone here. Today we're going to cover Key Concept 2.1. So I'll give you a second to pause and read the key concepts, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and get started. So here's a great map, a realistic map also, that shows us where the Europeans were in 1650. So it's not like one of those crazy maps that shows what the Europeans claimed, like land all the way out to the Pacific and stuff. But here's actually the areas of control that the Europeans did have around 1650. So we can pretty much see basically three European nations. We see the British, obviously. In the eastern seaboard, we see the Spanish in Central America and Florida and the Caribbean, and then of course we see the French along the St. Lawrence Seaway and the Great Lakes. Now there are three types of colonies that we see getting set up here. Okay, we see tribute colonies in Spain. Okay, in the Spanish colonies, meaning that the Spanish are pretty much just extracting wealth out of those colonies. For example, gold and silver and certain cash crops. We also see plantation colonies developing in the Chesapeake region. Um, we also see colonies developing in the Caribbean and also, places that will become South Carolina and Georgia. And then we have Neo-Europe colonies that develop, in New England and these middle colonies where pretty much we have Europeans trying to create essentially a new Europe. And if you think about city names that you see quite often, in Wisconsin we have a lot of New Berlins and German towns and new this and new that, and that kind of shows how it's very neo-colonial. Okay, so there are kind of the three types of colonies that we are going to see in this region. Okay. But specifically in America, obviously, we're going to be looking at Neo-European colonies and plantation colonies. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start with the Chesapeake, all right? The Chesapeake is the first successful English colony that is settled. Um, and it's important to know why they settled it. We have people coming to the Chesapeake mainly for economic reasons. People are trying to make some wealth here, make some money. So we have lots and lots of men coming over for the most part into the Chesapeake. Now the first established colony that survives is Jamestown. Okay, so Jamestown gets set up in 1607, and we kind of see this theme starting in Jamestown where we see a lot of Europeans are dying in these regions. Okay, and the reason we see a lot of people dying is because Europeans do not do well in regions like the Chesapeake, regions that are very swampy and warm, full of mosquitoes, full of mosquito-borne illnesses like malaria. And so early on in the Chesapeake, we see a lot of death. Okay, a lot of really interesting stats on this page. We see 50% of the people don't live to their 20th birthday. We see very, very slow growth in this region early on. In fact, growth only comes from pretty much immigrants coming to this region, and obviously a lot of them are dying. So we see a very unhealthy region initially. Okay, we also see kind of some very interesting developments socially because there's not a lot of men. We pretty much have a society early on where you don't really have too many families. Okay, by 1650, men outnumbered women 6-1. And by 1700, while the ratio had gotten better, it's still at 3-2 by 1700. And so because we see, very few families, obviously this is going to have an impact on how the region develops. They're not going to have a very tight-knit community that we're going to find in New England. We're going to see, a little bit more immoral behavior to the Christian standard taking place. For instance, we know that roughly, 1/3 of brides were pregnant when they were married, so premarital intercourse is something that was, for the most part, pretty common, even though you would expect in a tight-knit society that would be much, much lower. We see very few children having both parents alive for very long. Most children never had any grandparents. So you can imagine kind of the effect of that kind of family life would have on people. Okay? They don't really have that tight-knit family. And that's going to impact, like I said, how the Chesapeake develops initially. People are there not to have families. People are there to make money. And tobacco is a great way to make money at this time. We do see The price of tobacco does come down, as that graph does show, but initially people are going there for tobacco. It's a way to make a lot of money, and that's why people go there. Um, the economy, though, is also going to foreshadow, what happens with Native Americans there, because as more people come to this region, and as they start to farm this region, tobacco is very, very nasty to the soil. It depletes the minerals quite quickly, um, and as a result, the British are going to have to expand further into the interior, and as they expand, they're going to come into conflict with Native Americans. So their economy is going to directly correlate with conflict with the natives. Okay, because so many people die, and because tobacco is a pretty labor-intensive crop to grow, um, we need to have the Chesapeake needs to have lots of people coming there to farm. The only problem is that people die pretty quickly there. So this is clear that a labor system needs to be developed in the Chesapeake that meets the demands of all these tobacco farms. And so the first thing that everyone tries is indentured servants, where you basically have poor English farmers typically, or homeless whites, or what have you. Basically work for 4 or 5 years, and they're brought over, and after 4 or 5 years, they're let go to have their own land, allegedly. Oftentimes, it doesn't work very well. We see, some pretty grisly statistics for indentured servants. 50% of them die before their contract is up. 25% remain landless, and really only 25% actually get their land and are able to start farming. But the land is only way out on the frontier amongst the Native Americans, so it's a little bit more dangerous out there. So that's kind of an interesting thing about the indentured servants. Now, eventually what we see happening, and this is perhaps one of the most significant events in colonial history, is eventually the indentured servants get kind of fed up. And by indentured servants, I mean the poor whites. So the people that were indentured servants, they'd served their time, and now they were free to kind of go as they please. But we see these guys becoming very unsettled. And in the late 1600s, we see landless whites, poor Africans, basically joining together to resist the established elite in Virginia, because they feel like their needs aren't being served very well. These people, these poor whites and these poor blacks out in the West, they're unhappy because the Native Americans are attacking them, probably because they're infringing on their land, but they don't think like the established elite in Jamestown really care very much. And so there's a rebellion that pops up. These poor whites and these poor blacks kind of join together, and they're threatening the establishment. And for a while, they're pretty successful. I mean, they drove the governor out of Jamestown, they burned it to the ground. But unfortunately for them, Nathaniel Bacon suddenly dies of, I believe, dysentery, and the rebellion kind of putters out, and the establishment is able to, kill the ringleaders, and it kind of ends this rebellion. The one important thing about Bacon's rebellion, though, is that it kind of freaks out the established wealth, the established planters or whatever in Virginia. They're kind of freaked out because here you have poor whites, you have poor blacks, and they're kind of merging together, and they have something in common, and they're threatening the establishment. And so it becomes clear to these wealthy planters that they can't trust these indentured servants, that they have to do something. And so what they decide to do is kind of shift away from indentured servitude and start to shift more towards African slavery. Now, African slavery has been around at this point for several decades, but it is right around here where we see that distinct shift towards African slavery. Okay? And here you can see some of the statistics bear that out. If you look in the top right-hand corner of your slide, you can see the shift from European servitude to African servitude. It's pretty obvious. Okay? We also see the development of race. Whites become aware of race. In fact, the term whites isn't something that people normally used when talking about Europeans. Europeans didn't think of themselves as white or a white race. They basically identified themselves as nationalities, and blacks were the same way. Blacks did not consider themselves black. They were clan-based society in Africa typically, and that's how they kind of identified themselves. But as we have this shift away from indentured servitude, it becomes pretty apparent to the whites and blacks in America that black equals slave. And we start to kind of get this awareness of race in America. And eventually, we see the Southern whites begin to pass laws that strip Africans of legal rights. And we see chattel slavery get developed. And chattel slavery is basically children are enslaved because their parents are enslaved. So slavery is hereditary in a sense. So this is a very important American history because this is kind of where racism comes from. We see this awareness of race starts. We see laws begin to be passed that separate whites from blacks, laws that demean Africans, laws that don't allow them to hold certain jobs, laws that basically keep them in perpetual poverty and perpetually at the lowest notch in society. And, obviously we still feel the repercussions of that today. So the Atlantic slave trade picks up after Bacon's Rebellion, and I'm sure we've seen this map many, many times. We can see, where most of the Africans were enslaved that were taken to the Caribbean and Brazil. It's important to note that during this time, more Africans come to the New World than Europeans do. Unfortunately, though, many of the Africans die on the plantations because the work is so horrendous. And we also can see with this map here the increase in slavery from 1680, okay, so shortly after Bacon's Rebellion, to 1740. So we see a very clear shift from white servitude to African slavery during this time frame. We also see different forms of slavery developing in the colonies, in the South Atlantic, meaning South Carolina and the West Indies. We see a very different type of slavery than the Chesapeake. In South Atlantic slavery, we see much more brutal conditions. Slaves are commonly worked to death because it is so difficult work. The sugar plantations, like I said, require a lot of manual labor, and the conditions are horrible. And so typically people don't live very long in those conditions. We don't see many slave families popping up. And we also see a very unique African culture in those slave communities because new Africans have to be brought in to replace, the slaves that are dying off from all the work. And so we constantly have an influx of African culture being poured into this South Atlantic system, in South Carolina and the West Indies. Whereas in the Chesapeake, while tobacco is still physically demanding and it takes a lot of people to grow it, it's not back-breaking work like sugar and rice can be to farm. And so as a result, we see more slave families developing in the Chesapeake. And because we have more slave families developing, we have some sort of normalcy, in that region, in that region. And we also see more American-born Africans. So African Americans are being born in this region. And as a result, we see a less distinct African culture in this region than we see in the Caribbean and in the Deep South. Obviously, slavery is a horrible thing in America. In fact, many people call it America's original sin. But we see slaves being treated terribly, obviously. Degradation is common. Dehumanizing people is common. 12 Years a Slave just came out the past year or so. That kind of really highlights just how terrible slavery was and kind of visualizes it for people. Sexual assault was common. In fact, there was a plantation owner in Jamaica known as Thomas Thistlewood who committed almost 4,000 sex acts against his enslaved women over a period of 37 years, and we know this because he recorded it. So like I said, slavery is a terrible thing, obviously, but it's also interesting how these enslaved peoples, even though they are subjugated and treated so horribly, it is fascinating how Africans were able to preserve some of their traditions, and not only preserve those traditions, but also to have those traditions and beliefs kind of melt in with European beliefs and American beliefs. And we see this unique blend of kind of European and African culture that starts to develop that involves music, that involves foods. For instance, if you think about Southern cuisine, there's a heavy influence from um, African foods were spicy and jambalaya and obviously barbecue and fried chicken and a lot of staples in the American diet were heavily influenced by Africans. So it's interesting to look at, despite the fact they were subjugated, how Africans were able to kind of shape an American identity and shape American culture despite their status in society at that time. So let's kind of shift gears here and let's go up to New England. New England's much different than the Chesapeake. Weather-wise, it's much more European, if that makes sense. Um, so it's not as big of a shock for the Europeans that come over to New England because the region is very, like I said, it's something that they're very used to. Cold winters, clean water, less disease are some of the staples of this region. Whereas in the Chesapeake, it's warm, it's humid, swampy, lots of mosquitoes, malaria, and stuff like that are common. But in New England, we see a couple of key differences here. People migrate as families. Okay, many come over for religious freedom, not to practice religious freedom, but they want their freedom to practice the religion the way they think it should be practiced. And so as a result, we see a much more tight-knit community-based society that develops opposed to the Chesapeake, which is less family structured because it's not so swampy up here in New England. People live longer. Children oftentimes have both their parents and even some grandparents, and so we do see a much different society developing up here, in New England. We also see a society that is very homogeneous, meaning that it's one type of people, pretty much like just the Puritans. Whereas in the South, we see a more biracial society developing with Africans and the British. So those are some key differences that we see in New England. Now, the middle colonies are very interesting because they are the ones that I would call the most American because they are the most diverse. It is in the middle colonies where we see a very heterogeneous society developing, meaning many different types of people there, whether, from the English, Scots, Irish, French, German, Dutch, are just some examples of the people that you are going to see in that region. And also, obviously, Africans as well. In Delaware, we do see some slavery in Delaware on a pretty high level, and some tobacco farms there. And we also see, like I said, a diversity in the economy. We see a lot of farming cereal crops there, so it's kind of like the breadbasket of America. Like I said, we do see some tobacco being grown in Delaware. We see shipbuilding, we see commerce in this region. So overall, religiously it's diverse, demographically it's diverse, economically it's diverse, and I think when we think about America, usually it's diversity as far as what we kind of think of typically. Okay, so anyways, I'm gonna stop right there for today. So anyways, I hope this was a good review, and yeah, have a great day.